When they go low, we go high. The push for civility on the 2020 campaign trail and why it might not last long. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo sits down with CBN News, the latest from his Middle East trip from Israel, and how some are hoping to fight back against President Trump stacking the Supreme Court. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Can civility last on the campaign trail? Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm John Jessup.
And I'm Jenna Browder. Well, to attack or not to attack, that is the question Democrats must answer as they prepare to face off in what looks to be a very tough presidential primary.
Some candidates are floating the idea of peace and civility, while others want to challenge President Trump with a dose of his own medicine. Amber Strong has a look at the civility battle within the party.
There's no debating it. President Trump has made firing back on his opponents his own personal calling card.
I've told her I don't like, the administration.
From the husband of his own senior advisor.
He's a whack job, there's no question about it.
To the late Senator John McCain.
Not my kind of guy, but some people like him, and I think that's great.
President Trump brings a certain level of fight to the Oval Office.
When you attack him, he will punch back 10 times harder.
Campaign trail was no different. Remember Lying Ted, Low Energy Jeb, or Little Marco? So is there room for civility among the 2020 Democratic hopefuls? Might there be a Mr. Nice Guy or gal? Presidential hopeful Cory Booker thinks so.
There's a lot of folks who want to fight fire with fire. I ran a fire department. I don't think that's a good strategy.
Candidate and Afghan war vet Pete Buttigieg, however, is taking the fight squarely to the president and Vice President Pence.
How could he allow himself to become the cheerleader of the porn star presidency?
So what's a candidate to do?
He allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison.
Former presidential contender Michael Dukakis, who knows a thing or two about the power of a persuasive ad campaign, gave the Boston Globe this advice for would-be Democrats. He's a nickname guy, and we know he's a congenital liar. I'd start calling him Pinocchio and stick with it. But former Obama faith director Michael Ware told CBN News leaning the other direction is pivotal.
The way to restore sort of a sense of hope and some basic level of trust in our civic processes is not to imitate Trump, but to reclaim civility. There's a big appetite, not just among Democrats, but among Republicans.
He may be onto something. Axios put together a focus group of Trump voters from Wisconsin, a swing state. They're happy with policies, but not the rhetoric. But do Democrats have the willpower to go high when the pressure against civility comes from within? Remember when former VP Joe Biden said this about Mike Pence?
It was followed on by a guy who's a decent guy.
Just days later, he walked it back after pressure from LGBTQ rights activist Cynthia Nixon. Still, the former Veep insists there's room for civility.
We don't demonize our opponents. We don't belittle them. We might even say a nice word every once in a while about a Republican when they do something good.
It's a long road to 2020, and as with all things, time will tell. Amber Strong, CBN News, Washington.
And for more, Amber actually sat down with Kayleigh McEnany, National Press Secretary for the Trump-Pence re-election campaign. Take a look.
Kayleigh, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Democrats are right out the gate trying to draw, not all of them, but some of the contenders are drawing a stark contrast between themselves and President Trump, and the main thing they want to talk about is civility, saying that we're going to rise above the insults and the tweets. Do they have a leg to stand on?
No, because they're trying the same line of attack that they tried in 2016, which didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is very clear. Voters care about the economy. They care about their paychecks. They care about the livelihood and well-being of their families, the security of this country, the things that President Trump has delivered on. And if they're trying to draw a contrast, we are too, and that contrast is the choice between socialism and radicalism and free market policies and principles and the values like keeping babies alive outside of the womb that this country was founded upon: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Is some of that kind of lost, though, when the thing you hear from the president over the weekend is about John McCain or now George Conway? We know that 70-something% of voters are happy with the economy. Should that be the thing we're hearing more? than John McCain?
Well, I think you have to hear both, and here's why. You know, the president is under a constant onslaught of attack, and when we talk about John McCain, we can all agree he was a hero and thank him for his service to this country. But that doesn't nullify the dossier that was passed to the FBI that was full of lies and mistruths about the president. We found out more about that this week, which prompted the president to respond. So he feels he has to defend himself. We think he should defend himself, but also tout the economy, which he can do both at the same time.
At the same time, we talk about, I covered the 2016 campaign. You've been on the ground in some of these swing states. It's important to know the heart of the people and what people are saying. Is there a concern that voters will grow tired of the rhetoric from both sides, tired of the fighting, tired of the punching?
We're not concerned about that, and here's why. We look at the data, and for instance, the last rally in El Paso, the data we saw come in showed that of the people who registered for the rally, 50% were Democrats, 25% were swing voters, and 25% Republican. That's extraordinary that you had that many Democrats signing up for the president's rally. What that is a sign up to us is that he's expanding the base, that more voters are coming on board. And why? Because it goes back to where we began, that this is about the economy, it's about wages, it's about rectifying our trade relations and all the issues that we don't too often hear about in the media.
The president is having to punch back against Democrats. That's kind of comes with the game. But at the same time, we see sort of a, not dissension, but a little bit of a breakaway when it comes to the John McCain situation. Is he worried about that as we get closer to 2020, that more and more Democrats, we saw it before with the national emergency, having, I believe it was 12 vote against him. Are we worried about something in the party being a problem and kind of pulling away from this president?
We're not, and here's why. Because we look at the voters in this party who make up the party. You know, it's great that we have Republican congressmen and women, but why are they there? Because of the voters. So we look at what the voters are saying, and our voters, in every poll that they're asked, do you approve of the president? He has record high approval ratings. He's hit 93%, as he's tweeted about, which is a record high for modern sitting presidents other than Bush during 9/11. And we look at the fact that in the Republican primary, he won more Republican primary voters than any nominee in the history of our party, more than Reagan, more than Bush, more than George H.W. Bush. Our voters have sent a pretty unmistakable symbol or message, rather, that they stand with the president. So we're not concerned about, you know, Republicans in Washington breaking away here and there.
Kind of last question. How would you advise, and this is going to sound absolutely crazy, you were there in 2016. We saw some Republicans try to kind of punch back, and it didn't work. How would you advise these Democrats who, some are saying we're going to take it to him every single time he says something, and others who are saying we're going to rise above and we're better than this? What's your advice?
Well, they have a hard task ahead of them, but hey, stay focused on the issues. And, you know, the president will be out there in a rally in just a week and a half. And when you watch the rallies, he talks about immigration, he talks about national security, he talks about the economy, because he's delivered on those promises. So the Democrats can talk about those issues, but they haven't delivered on those issues. So, hey, if they want to talk about it, but it's going to be very hard to compete with the president's record delivery of accomplishments.
Kayleigh, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, President Trump signed an executive order today to protect free speech on college campuses. The move puts universities on notice. Support free speech or risk losing federal funding. CB News White House correspondent Ben Kennedy joins us from the North Lawn with the details. Ben?
Well, Jenna, President Trump called this a big, momentous day and was super excited to sign this executive order. It ensures grant dollars, as you were talking about, go to public universities that vow to uphold the First Amendment. This is in response to people saying their views are actually being suppressed on campuses. And to break it down for us, I just spoke with Jarrett Stepman with the Daily Signal and Heritage Foundation, who has written in depth about this very issue, campus free speech.
It's very bad. I mean, I think what we have is on a lot of college campuses, we have targeted activist groups. I think they represent, in many ways, a minority, but a very powerful one that is attempting to shut down free speech on our campuses. They equate free speech with hate speech. They equate it with violence, and they use often, I think, many times thuggish tactics to try to push speakers they don't like. Many of these speakers tend to be on the conservative side of the spectrum, and I think this is something that has gotten out of control in this country.
But does this executive order pretty much reinforce what schools are already supposed to be doing?
Yeah, it is. It's basically telling them to do their jobs. I mean, frankly, free speech is something that should be valued in this entire country, not just in our schools, but especially in places where, you do have a lot of taxpayer money that is going to these institutions. What does it say? That they allow violations of free speech to occur, that they allow students to be shouted down, to be shut down, to be stopped from speaking their voice in these institutions. It's a very bad thing. And I think that this executive order, I think, doubles down on that, saying that especially if you are receiving a taxpayer money, if you are a public institution, you have a duty to protect the First Amendment rights of students that go at those schools. This should be a very basic thing, but as we've seen from news reports the last few years, it's something that isn't always upheld in our schools.
You're talking about this being a basic thing. Does this move also make higher education more transparent?
I think it does make higher education more transparent. I think these incidents need to get, they need to be more widely reported. Parents deserve to know what's going on in these institutions they send their children to, they send their kids to. I mean, what does it say to Americans, even those who don't send their children there? What does it say that our universities that are supposed to be teaching young people what it is to be an American, they're supposed to be teaching, they're conveying our values. What does it say when we're allowing grievous assaults on free speech rights?
Now, Stedman told me he does hope this does bring some sort of a change. This executive order requires the Department of Education to publish information on earnings, debt, default rates, and loan repayment rates, but it would not affect student aid money. That is the latest outside the White House. Ben Kennedy, CBN News.
Thanks, Ben. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo completes the second leg of his trip through the Middle East, and CBN News is there with him. Chief political analyst David Brody accompanied Pompeo on his flight to Kuwait and Israel, all as the secretary tries to make headway against the region's biggest threat, Iran.
As he boarded his plane for the Middle East this week, Secretary Pompeo had a long ride and a full plate. We were on board to hear his extensive agenda. One item looms very large. Some might call it impossible, but it's a mission he chose to accept. Find a way to halt Iran's growing power in this volatile region.
As CBN News has been reporting for years, Israel is Iran's main target. And that conversation was a major part of the discussion between Secretary Pompeo and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The United States and Israel are working in close coordination to roll back Iranian aggression in the region and around the world. Secretary and I just spent the first part of our meetings discussing exactly how to do that, and I think there are ways that will intensify the pressure even more.
Pompeo's visit comes just a few weeks before Israel's big election. The visit is seen by some as a way for the Trump administration to boost Netanyahu's prospects. But politics aside, the hawkish Pompeo and the conservative Netanyahu have a strong bond, just like the two countries. The secretary got a first-hand look at the new American embassy in Jerusalem, a move by President Trump that has garnered wide support here. Pompeo's Israel stop also included meetings with Israeli and Mediterranean leaders from Greece and Cyprus as they try to push new energy sources that will make them stronger and Iran weaker. Ultimately, all roads lead back to stopping Iranian influence. Recently, Israel's also been cracking down on efforts by the Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah to attack the Jewish state from the neighboring Golan Heights. And Netanyahu says that shows why Israel's presence is so important in that strategically key location.
All of you can imagine what would have happened if Israel were not in the Golan. We would have Iran on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. I think for this reason and for many more, I think it's time that the international community recognize Israel's stay in the Golan, the fact that the Golan will always remain part of the state of Israel.
Pompeo didn't announce any new change in U.S. policy on Israel's presence in the Golan, but he did make clear his love for this country.
I'm proud to be here again, not only as America's top diplomat, but also as a man of faith that is always newly inspired when I get the chance to travel to Israel.
Iran is not just a threat to Israel, but to stability through the Middle East. After Israel, Pompeo heads to Lebanon, where he'll make clear that Hezbollah's influence inside Lebanese politics is a major risk to peace in the area. He also made a visit to friendlier territory.
The Secretary of State began his trip to the Middle East here in Kuwait, getting the royal treatment for sure. Kuwait's a small country, roughly the size of New Jersey, but a very important one. It represents a bloc of nations of Sunni Muslim countries hoping to stay together, stick together, to prevent Iran from gaining a stronghold of influence here in the region. Kuwait is unique because it has relationships with both the U.S. and Iran. Pompeo needs Kuwait's help to make sure the economic sanctions against Iran are holding up and not being evaded.
The United States is seeking vigorous new efforts from all countries in the region to address the security challenges of our time. These challenges include defeating terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda for sure. Kuwait is a strong partner towards that goal.
It's all a work in progress in a part of the world where progress, if any, moves at a snail's pace.
And David joins us now from CBN News in the bureau there in Jerusalem. David, today the president, he made a big announcement about Israel and Golan Heights. Being there on the ground, what's been the reaction you've seen?
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu and Secretary of State Pompeo both, of course, applauding the move. And, of course, why wouldn't they? Benjamin Netanyahu actually getting pretty emotional. I don't know about teary-eyed, but, you know, he seemed a bit choked up at the fact that what he basically said that President Trump has done it again. A big move in support of Israel. We know about the U.S. Embassy, and this has got to rank right up there. I mean, you can make the argument that it might even be even more important than the U.S. Embassy, depending, excuse me, on how things play out up there with Hezbollah and Syria and Lebanon. Anyhow, the point is that it has been very, very strong reaction, and Mike Pompeo concurring with that as well.
David, at that press conference, the joint press conference with Netanyahu yesterday, Mike Pompeo took a hard stance against anti-Semitism. I know that you and Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell got a chance to speak with the Secretary today. Did he mention anything about that topic to you guys?
He did, John, and the reason he mentioned it to us is because we asked him about it, and we made sure it was pretty close to the top of the list. That's right. Chris Mitchell and I had a chance to interview Mike Pompeo here in Jerusalem, and the conversation turned to anti-Semitism and the Democrats. We know all about Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and some of her comments that have come out recently. So we asked him straight out about that, and he made some news. Let's move to the United States for a moment and anti-Semitism and the Democrats. They seem embroiled in this. There was a, I don't want to say a veiled shot, not that it was a shot, but at Ilhan Omar, you know, about the bigotry and the anti-Semitism inside the halls of Capitol Hill. How concerned are you about the rise of not just anti-Semitism around the world, but in that Democrat Party as well?
To see this from a member of Congress like Congresswoman Omar I talked about this being dark. The rise of anti-Semitism in the United States and in Europe and frankly all across the world is something that is deeply troubling. And to see someone, a duly elected congressman, behave in that way, to speak about anti-Semitism in that way is of great concern. It's great concern to me. This administration speaks the truth. And anti-Semitism is unacceptable in any form from anyone, but to see it come from one of America's leaders is just abhorrent.
You got the sense that Secretary Pompeo was kind of waiting to unload on the Congresswoman. Actually, Chris Mitchell and I were a bit surprised that he actually named her, and here on foreign soil, to say the least.
David, we understand Secretary Pompeo made a comparison between President Trump and a biblical figure. Tell us about that.
Yes, Jenna. You know, it's always Donald Trump and a big biblical figure. You know, it's just King Cyrus. I mean, just go on down the list. Yeah, Queen Esther, and as a matter of fact, it's Purim here. Well, it's Purim all over the world, but of course celebrated here in Jerusalem. And so Chris Mitchell asked the Purim CBN question, and here's the response.
Today's being Purim, celebration. Jews worldwide, and here in Jerusalem are talking about the fact that Esther, 2,500 years ago, saved the Jewish people with God's help from Haman. And now 2,500 years later, there's a new Haman here in the Middle East that wants to eradicate the Jewish people just like Haman did the state of Iran. Could it be that President Trump right now has been sort of raised for such a time as this, just like Queen Esther, to help save the Jewish people from an Iranian menace?
As a Christian, I certainly believe that's possible. It was remarkable. So we were down in the tunnels where we could see 3,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, if I have the history just right, to see the remarkable history of the faith in this place and the work that our administration has done to make sure that this democracy in the Middle East of this Jewish state remains. I'm confident that the Lord is at work here.
Quite a bit in that soundbite from Mike Pompeo to Chris Mitchell and I here in Jerusalem. I think the mainstream media may go a bit berserk after that. It's basically saying, as a Christian, that's what he said. I mean, as a Christian, I think it can be possible. It could be possible. They don't want that answer from Secretary Pompeo, so I think that's an issue. And then, of course, at the end where he says the Lord is at work here in Israel. Look, that's the daily double, as we call it. Jenna, John.
Thanks, David. And for more of David and Chris Mitchell's interview with Secretary Pompeo, make sure to tune in to Faith Nation tomorrow.
Well, how many Supreme Court justices is too many? Up next, the fight over capping the number of those serving on the High Court.
Welcome back. Packing the Supreme Court is becoming a key issue for 2020 White House hopefuls, with some Democrats vying for the party's nomination, signaling their support to expand the bench.
Now, one GOP lawmaker is trying to ensure that doesn't happen, introducing a constitutional amendment capping Supreme Court seats at 9. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson has more. Abigail?
That's right, John and Jenna. Tennessee Congressman Mark Green wants to put an end to talks of expanding the number of Supreme Court justices from 9 to 15, and he's introduced a law to make that official. Green argues that keeping the number of seats to the 9 that we currently have helps ensure that the U.S. Supreme Court remains an impartial branch.
Abigail, why does Green feel like this amendment is necessary?
Well, this talk of expanding the amount of justices used to be kind of a fringe idea. And even recently, when freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez started floating this idea of Democrats packing the court, as they say, and making the number 15 so that they have better chances of winning some of these high-profile cases in the court, it was really dismissed as a far-left fantasy. But what's changed is now we're seeing Democrat presidential candidates on the campaign trail talking about this idea, taking it seriously, saying they're open to it and they're interested. So now we're really kind of starting to see this as a debate, and we're seeing the beginnings of people really talking about this and debating whether or not they think it's a good idea or not.
And Abigail, what does Congressman Green's amendment exactly seek to do?
Well, it's important to note that the U.S. Constitution does not specify amount of justices on the Supreme Court. So what's being talked about right now of raising that number to 15 is legal. Now, historically, the number has gotten as low as 6 and as high as 10, but for decades, the standard has been the 9 that we currently have. And what Green's amendment says is that that should be the law of the land going forward, and that should be the official number.
All right, Abigail Robertson for us on Capitol Hill. Thank you, Abigail.
Well, the FBI is now looking into the Boeing 737 MAX 8 plane crashes. The investigation is now a criminal probe after new details emerged about the plane's certifications. It's not yet 100% clear what caused the crashes of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 or Indonesia's Lion Air Flight 610. Signs point to a malfunctioning software system meant to avoid stalls. Both of the crashed planes lacked optional safety features that could have helped pilots detect bad system readings. Boeing reportedly is set to update the stall avoidance system. In the meantime, the 737 MAX 8 is grounded in much of the world.
New Zealand is putting new limits on what type of guns there people can own. Today, the Prime Minister announced an immediate ban on all military-style semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. She also said the government would start a program to buy back those kinds of weapons from people who do own them. The move comes, it's a response to the mass shootings at 2 mosques in Christchurch last week, where 50 people were killed.
Coming up, how Operation Blessing is helping those fleeing the political chaos in Venezuela.
Well, the crisis in Venezuela shows no signs of letting up. Constant power outages, food shortages, and roving criminal gangs are driving more people to leave every day.
One border town in neighboring Colombia is struggling to keep pace with a flood of desperate people. But CBN's Operation Blessing is on the scene to help those in need.
Today, we're planning to have a medical brigade here on the way to Pamplona. Also, Operation Blessing is bringing some water solutions, so we're going to be setting up a water station, clean water station for the migrants.
Many of the migrants CBN News spoke with say they'd be happy to go home just as soon as Nicolas Maduro and his regime are no longer in power. In the meantime, Operation Blessing will be there to help the wary travelers keep walking towards a better life.
Yeah, Obi does some incredible work.
Incredible work and necessary for those people who are just in so much desperate need.
Yeah.
Well, that's going to do it for tonight's Faith Nation.
Have a great evening.